Welcome. We have a number of folks joining on site at Beacon Hill Friends House, and we have right now almost 30 people joining us on Zoom and counting. We're here to welcome you to the Ernest and Esther Weed Memorial Lecture by Beacon Hill Friends House. I'm going to take off my mask to do this introduction. So friends, welcome. My name is Jen Newman. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the executive director of Beacon Hill Friends House, which is a Quaker center for learning and action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values, based in downtown Boston and founded in 1957. We've been running this Ernest and Esther Weed Memorial Lecture since 1993, and it's endowed in honor of the longtime BHFH directors, Ernest and Esther. It features a prominent interpreter of Quakerism speaking on a topic of interest to friends in New England and beyond. And for this lecture, we bring you Brian Blackmore on the topic Quakers and the Gay Rights Movement. This lecture will teach us about gay rights activists in the 1960s and 70s who were trained by Quakers in nonviolent resistance, the influential gay rights leaders who were Quakers themselves, and the gay rights organizations that operated out of Quaker-owned properties. This lecture will also describe the presence of Quakers at the Stonewall riots and Quaker participation in the first Gay Pride parade. Before I introduce Brian and hand things over to him, I'd like to tell folks a story about Ernest Weed. In the year 2007, Cliff Putney and Sarah Spencer put together a Jubilee history celebrating the 50th anniversary of Beacon Hill Friends House. And in that history, where they interviewed former directors and assistant directors, in addition to using Ernest Weed's account of the history of the house, there's a story from assistant directors Joshua and Joyce Brown, who were assistant directors from 1979 to 1981. They shared, at the time Joshua and Joyce were in Boston, the gay rights movement was getting underway, and Ernest spoke out very strongly against gay rights at one board meeting. Joshua remembers that the issue had something to do with whether or not to allow a gay couple to live together at the house. Later that year, Johann Maurer organized a public forum on gay rights, and several very thoughtful and deeply spiritual gay people were speakers. At the end of the meeting, Ernest came down to the front of the room and said that he had opposed gay rights and homosexuality in general, all of his life, but that he wanted to say publicly that he knew that he had been wrong, and he embraced the speakers. The entire room, who knew Ernest, was astonished. That evening is impressed on Joshua's memory as a time when an older friend had the courage to change his heart and mind on a difficult subject. I'm glad to read you that story in this lecture named in Ernest's honor, but to also tell you that in the history of the Friends House since then, we have had many gay LGBTQ residents. We've had LGBTQ directors, board chairs, leadership, many in our community, including myself. And so I wanted to bring to you that slice of our own history about the way things can move and change. And to hear then this slice of history around the same time period from Brian. And so I'm honored to bring to you this topic for the Ernest and Esther Weed Memorial Lecture. I'm going to enter into a period of brief silence and turn things over to Brian when he is ready. Oh, I'm going to introduce Brian. I should probably tell you about him for a minute. Brian Blackmore holds a PhD in religious studies from Temple University, with extensive academic research and published writings examining the role that Quakers played in gay rights movements and the inclusion of gay and lesbian people in the Quaker tradition during the mid-20th century. He is a Quaker educator and community builder whose career has focused on religion, social justice, and peacemaking. With that, I'll enter into a period of silence and turn things over to Brian when he's ready. Thank you, friends.
Good afternoon, friends. Thank you, Jen. And thank you also to Brent, Beacon Hill House's program associate, board, and other staff of Beacon Hill House for inviting me to be here with you all today. I also want to extend gratitude and appreciation to many of the sponsors for the Making Quaker History series, the Carpenter Foundation, the Obadiah Brown Benevolent Fund, the New England Yearly Meetings Future Fund, and the American Friends Service Committee. I couldn't be here today, or the entire series wouldn't have been possible without all these people's and organizations' support. I'm very excited to share with you all a small portion of a larger body of research on Quakers and the advancement of gay rights that I've been developing for quite some time. My interest in this topic began taking shape over a dozen years ago when I was a graduate student at Chicago Theological Seminary. As I was learning to be an openly gay Quaker in the world at that time, I developed this obsession with Towards a Quaker View of Sex, a short 74-page pamphlet published by a group of 11 friends in Britain, which religious studies scholars now agree represents the first public and positive evaluation of gay and lesbian sexuality from any religious group. I was entirely fascinated by Towards a Quaker View of Sex. What did it say? Who wrote it? And what was its impact on the Religious Society of Friends? And as my fascination with this text grew deeper, I became connected with the LGBT Religious Archives Network, who asked me to support the development of an online exhibit about the production and text of Towards a Quaker View of Sex. And I encourage you all to check that out in your own time. After completing that work, I wrote my master's thesis about how Quaker beliefs in the universality of the inner light and Quaker quiet, unprogrammed worship may have influenced the authors of Towards a Quaker View of Sex to write it. In 2013, I enrolled in a PhD program at Temple University, which provided me with the support I needed to take on a more further study of Quaker involvement in the gay rights as an academic project. I found myself deep in these archives at the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College, looking at the personal files of Friends, as well as the business minutes donated by yearly meetings and the Friends for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Concerns. I also discovered important materials for my work in the archives at the American Friends Service Committee, Friends Journal, and the LGBT Religious Archives Network. What I uncovered in my research was truly extraordinary. And if you've been following us along in the Making Queer Quakers History series, you've already heard me laud these marvelous events conducted by Friends, but I wanted to repeat them one more time in case this was your first time with us. I found that Quakers in New York City opened the first social service organization for gay people in the United States in 1946. Over a decade and a half later, that small group of friends in Britain wrote Towards a Quaker View of Sex and shocked the world by proclaiming that homosexuality was not inconsistent with Christian teachings, nor was gay sex a sin or morally unsound. And when I looked even further, I found a lot more exciting events that I'm looking forward to sharing with you today, specifically focused on Quaker involvement in gay rights movements during the late 1960s and early 1970s, which occurred almost a decade after Towards a Quaker View of Sex. You will hear this evening about an unofficial group of friends at the Friends General Conference annual gathering who wrote the first statement in support of bisexuality from a religious assembly. Quaker involvement in the Stonewall riots, an event which is often credited with launching the gay rights movement in 1969, and Quaker participation in the first gay pride parades in 2 major U.S. cities. I will also share some stories with you about influential gay rights groups in the 1960s and 70s who sought training from Quakers in nonviolent resistance, some leaders of gay rights groups who were Quakers themselves, and a few major gay rights organizations which operated out of Quaker-owned properties. I want to be very clear from the beginning, however, that the focus of my talk tonight will be on a specific time period, the late 1960s and early 1970s. If you are interested in Quaker involvement in LGBTQ plus justice prior to this period, I encourage you to register for past events in the Making Queer Quaker History series, and Jen assures me that recordings of those will be provided to you even after they have already occurred. You could also anticipate and hopefully purchase my forthcoming book with Brill Publications under the title To Hear and to Respond, The Quakers' Groundbreaking Push for Gay Liberation, 1946 to 1973, which should be available for purchase sometime in early 2025. I'll also be co-facilitating a workshop about its title, A Century of Queer Quaker Resistance, with Jim Fussell, who's joining us on Zoom this evening, a Quaker scholar in residence at Earlham College, during the online gathering of Friends General Conference this upcoming February. I also want to be somewhat emphatic before I dive in about what Quakers were talking about during this historical moment. And you will notice that transgender issues and experience are not being addressed. In future work, I look forward to studying the role that Quakers played in the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s, the commitments to Friends to same-sex marriage in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, and the evolution and enduring complexity of Quaker attitudes towards transgender people. However, in the period that I will be discussing today, these were not publicly part of the conversation amongst friends. And I don't want lack of attention to them to imply that somehow I feel invested in the erasure of transgender justice and experience and concerns. It's just not what I discovered in the archive of my research. So with those pieces of housekeeping and framing in place, let's go ahead. And I'm excited to tell you the story of how Quakers, specifically in the liberal unprogrammed tradition, entered into the gay rights movement. The first Quaker to become a leader of a gay rights organization was James B. Osgood, a member of 57th Street Meeting in Chicago, who also used the pseudonym Jim Bradford in the 1960s and 1970s to conceal his identity. It was common at this time for gay men and lesbians to use pseudonyms to steer clear of the threat of imprisonment, eviction, public humiliation, and even loss of employment. In the summer of 1965, Bradford was elected to serve as the vice president of Mattachine Midwest. Within a few months, he would become its president. Bradford grew the membership of Mattachine Midwest from about a dozen individuals to 130 members. He created a newsletter, forged an alliance with homophile groups in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., and formally affiliated Mattachine Midwest with the East Coast Homophile Organization. He also advanced a concern among members of Mattachine Midwest for the criminalization of homosexuality and police surveillance of gay and lesbian communities. According to Saint Suki de LaCroix, a historian of Chicago gay history, after Jim Bradford became president in November 1965, Mattachine Midwest took a more activist turn, primarily targeting an out-of-control Chicago police force. And for folks who are good students of LGBT history, you might know that the other homophile organizations on the East and West Coast were kind of invested in these respectability politics and didn't have this kind of like spite and vinegar within them that Osgood, maybe because of his Quaker values and speaking truth to power kind of approach, brought to Mattachine Midwest. So, contrary to the widespread assumptions about the cultural and political conservatism of Quakers, Bradford promoted cultural and political revolution. In a letter to the editor for Vector, a magazine produced by a San Francisco-based homophile group, he lambasted gay men for the way they ridiculed the hippie movement. He noted that hippies were far more accepting of gay people than many of their heroes on the left. Quote, "If we identify with conservatives in a pinch to look respectable, we are merely deluding ourselves," said Bradford. And I'm using Bradford as his chosen pseudonym because that was the name he preferred at the time. And Bradford pushed Mattachine Midwest into direct conflict with police. And the more he aligned his vision for gay liberation with the hippie movement, the more Quakers were seen by gay rights activists as kind of cool, kind of revolutionary, connected to the radical left. Bradford deliberately shaped Mattachine Midwest with Quaker values. And this made Mattachine Midwest distinct from the homophile groups operating on the East and West Coast. Sitting next to Valerie Taylor, another co-founder of Mattachine Midwest, who would later become Quaker in life, Bradford told a radio interviewer that the first Mattachine meeting he attended in New York City felt like a Quaker business meeting. The order and seriousness with which the members conducted their work reminded him of the slow, deliberate, and often solemn manner by which Quakers make their decisions. Bradford is also deserving of recognition for drawing attention to his sexuality in Quaker periodicals at a time when coming out was dangerous. In 1965, he published a letter to the editor in Friends Journal using his given name. And while he did not speak directly about his sexuality at this particular time, he did congratulate Towards a Quaker View of Sex for articulating an important perspective on morality, one that he argued was worth more attention in the Religious Society of Friends. About 6 years later, in another letter to the editor titled Towards a Quaker View of Homosexuality, Bradford became the first openly gay Quaker to identify as gay in a Quaker tract. His sexuality was implied, but yet kind of obvious when he let friends know that he was associated with Mattachine Midwest and that, quote, much loving concern had been poured into his gay rights activism from the 57th Street meeting. In an effort to solicit support for the gay rights movement, Bradford reminded readers of the historic experience of Friends when they defended the human dignity and rights of oppressed minorities. Let me share some of his words with you right now. Friends traditionally have asked what they could do to help when problems have been presented to them. We can speak out when we hear about instances of police harassment or firings or other acts of bigotry. Most friends are horrified when Jews or Blacks are let go or convicted, but many people are accustomed to hearing about the mistreatment of homosexuals without seeing the parallel. Indeed, I know this well. When I was a faculty member at Westtown School, a Quaker school in Pennsylvania, after the deaths of George Floyd, the faculty and students became highly active in the Black Lives Matter movement. After the massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, I came to a faculty meeting the very next day and didn't hear a peep of concern about it. Bradford pressed further with 3 calls to action for Quaker meetings. 1, to speak out against injustices. 2, to openly express acceptance of homosexual members. And 3, to demonstrate support for gay rights by participating in protests and direct actions. He also pleaded for Friends to condemn President Nixon, an evangelical Quaker, for refusing to engage with the report his administration had commissioned by Evelyn Hooker on homosexuality. Friends Journal received numerous reactions to Bradford and subsequent letters to the editor. The first affirmed his claim that Friends should care for those that suffer at the hands of state-sanctioned violence, but caution Friends against disobedience to Christian teachings about gay and lesbian sexuality. Other letters applauded Bradford's courage and called for the Religious Society of Friends to profess solidarity with the gay rights movement. Within months, 2 more Friends came out as gay in Friends Journal, one by his actual name and another disguised by a clever pseudonym, A. Bradford II. A small group of Quakers, admittedly all gay white men, used these letters in the editor in Friends Journal to find one another, and they eventually formed an informal network of gay friends, later to be known as the Committee of Concern. I'm going to share with y'all more about the evolution of the Committee of Concern, but let's turn our attention now, somewhat abruptly maybe, to the role that Quakers played in a monumentally important event, which many credit for accelerating the gay rights movement in the mid-20th century. In 1969, as this network of gay friends was forming at the instigation of Bradford Coming Out and Friends Journal, eyewitnesses tell us that Quakers were present at the Stonewall riots. The abbreviated summary of events, which happened at Stonewall in 1969, for anyone joining us who doesn't know, is roughly as follows. A police raid sparked a spontaneous act of rebellion from LGBTQ people in response to brutal, repeated, and relentless police regulation of gay and lesbian behavior in places where LGBTQ people gathered. The riots spread over multiple days in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. They were filled with camp, with protesters singing, "We are the Stonewall girls, we wear our hair in curls, we wear our dungarees above our Nelly knees," and incredible violence. Although nobody was permanently injured or killed, on the first night of Stonewall, bar patrons threw coins at police and attempted to light the bar on fire while police were still inside. Reports speak about parking meters being uprooted, stones, or maybe bricks, we're not sure, were thrown, and several nights of protests involving thousands of people followed. The bartender at Stonewall, his name Fred E. Tree, told reporters of the Guardian newspaper that Quakers were giving medical treatment to injured rioters in nearby Washington Square Park. And quote, "That's why the Quakers still march at Pride every year and get a huge cheer." Another likely reason, and the reason I actually think is the reason that Quakers participated in the first large-scale march for gay rights in the United States, is because they were invited to do so. 3 hours before the first Gay Pride Parade began, two friends from the American Friends Service Committee's Quaker Project on Community Conflict addressed over 100 parade marshals who were volunteers responsible for the safety of all the marchers. The Quaker AFSC staff gave instructions on what to do if violence erupted from the crowd or police. They told the marshals not to wear jewelry, watches, or anything vulnerable that might be confiscated, and that marshals should continually remember their responsibility to the welfare of the marchers, even when they themselves were put in danger. The AFSC staff then introduced everyone to a series of role-playing exercises, a form of training they had successfully experimented with during the civil rights movement. One parade marshal volunteered to perform the part of a violent bystander. "Cocksucker," he yelled, and the Quaker facilitators described what typically comes next. They back away, size one another up. The larger of the two lunges, falls on the other guy. The Quakers asked the role players to pretend to tackle one another, and they instructed the other marshals to surround and smother them. A pile of bodies carefully placed one on top of one another served to demonstrate the efficacy of this nonviolent tactic. The two actors relaxed, released their grip on one another in order to break free from the larger pile. And the AFSC Quaker staff members must have impressed the gay rights activists because no more in October of 1970, a mere few months after the Christopher Street Liberation Day parade, Quakers would be invited again to train gay activists for demonstrations they had planned for the Democratic National Convention. Shortly after Stonewall, a small group of, and here's some images of the Christopher Street Liberation Day parade. I wasn't able to find a photo of Quakers in the 1970 parade, so you'll see a group of friends in the Pride Parade in New York City in 1980. That was the best I could do. Shortly after Stonewall, a small group of gay friends established what was sometimes affectionately referred to as a gay Quaker commune in Sumneytown, Pennsylvania. These friends were part of the New Swarthmore movement, a communal living experiment started by young adult friends at a gathering in Clinton Hill, New York in 1969. The New Swarthmore movement was about radical simplicity, opposition to war, and a revitalization of the practices and principles of early Friends. They named themselves after Margaret Fell's home, Swarthmore Hall, where the first generation of Friends in the 17th century operated social services to support persecuted Quakers and prepare traveling ministers to spread the teachings of Quakerism. The Valiant 60, sometimes they were called. Income from apple picking over the summer months supported each and every person's pursuit of social work projects throughout the rest of the year, and all of their property was communal, and all expenses were covered by a shared fund. Jeffrey Kaiser, a key figure in the New Swarthmore movement and one of the leaders of the Sumneytown gay commune, was a young adult friend whose experience in anti-war and civil rights movements would help offer him leadership to the Committee of Concern, that fledgling network of gay friends in the United States who were becoming connected to one another after Bradford came out in Friends Journal. Kaiser was raised by a Quaker mother and an Episcopalian father, both Republicans, who had stopped associating with Quakers when their meeting took a stance against the Korean War. After a few years, he rejoined his home meeting and he became deeply involved in the activities of the Young Friends of North America, an autonomous, self-directed Quaker organization that encouraged progressive social thought and activism. Through Young Friends, Kaiser traveled widely and became involved in the Black Civil Rights Movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and many other revolutionary societies of the 1960s. He eventually established the new Swarthmore community in Sumneytown, PA, which in the tradition of other Swarthmore communities was given a name, Three Flowers, for the faith, hope, and love named in 1 Corinthians 13. Three Flowers was founded by Kaiser in 1970 after he invited a small community, including 2 gay couples, to worship in a cabin he had purchased along a nearby creek. Another important person in the Three Flowers community was Larry Lee Scott Butler, who had extensive experience in the civil rights movement and significant connections to leftist groups. In 1965, he was mentored by Bayard Rustin when he participated in the Summer Community Organization and Political Education Project in Atlanta, a program sponsored by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Butler said, quote, "Every time Bayard Rustin speaks, introduces someone, or just talks, I go wild." After a year of organizing in the South, Butler turned down an offer to continue working for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and moved to Philadelphia. There, he took an interest in the Janus Society, an early homophile organization, and its founder, Clark Pollock. Butler had his first sexual experience with Pollock, and through the Janus Society, he became more involved in gay rights activism. In 1970, he joined the Gay Liberation Front, marched in that first gay Christopher Street Liberation Day parade, and served as an official delegate of the Gay Liberation Front at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention. Years later, when Butler served as clerk for the first Quaker gay rights group in Philadelphia, his clerking style would be characterized by the hallmarks of someone who had been trained by Black civil rights leaders and the radical left. In 1970, the informal group of gay friends that had learned about one another through Friends Journal, including Butler, Kaiser, Bradford, and A. Bradford II, made plans to meet for the first time in Butler's living room. Bradford and Ron Matson, a Quaker pastor from Minneapolis who had recently come out to his congregation, had asked Butler to host a gathering when many members of the informal network of gay friends were expected to be in Philadelphia for an AFSC event. At that first meeting, the group decided to organize an unprecedented assembly of gay friends at the next FGC gathering, which was being planned at Ithaca College in New York State. They advertised about this gathering in the New Republic, a leftist periodical, as well as Friends Journal, asking anyone who was interested to send their contact information to Butler's address. The group then met at Ray Street Meeting House, where the AFSC central offices is, where I go to work every day, and where Butler was also a member, to discuss further planning. When Butler requested to reserve a room in the meeting house, he was asked the name of the group, but they did not have one. It was actually through a stutter that he uttered the closeted name, the Committee of Concern. The group actually liked this name because it protected their privacy. Similar to Bradford choosing a pseudonym, the Committee of Concern members were very anxious about the consequences of being out in a world that could harm them. At the second meeting of the group of concern, the group discussed how they might organize a gathering of gay friends at FGC Summer Gathering. And Butler advocated for this specifically Quaker fellowship because friends had shared values and attitudes which were not greatly understood, nor could they be fruitfully discussed in circles of homosexual people who were not Quakers. For example, non-friends were not likely to understand or be able to usefully discuss various pastoral concerns that arise in Quaker meetings vis-a-vis homosexually oriented members. Friends who did not drink or who wore plain dress, as Kaiser and Butler did, they did not feel drawn to bars and other places of homosexually oriented people. Luckily, Kaiser sat on the organizing committee for the Friends General Conference annual gathering, and he was able to make swift arrangements so that members of the Committee of Concern could obtain housing next to one another in the same building. What was at once an underground community of gay Quakers who only knew each other through public and private letter writing was now becoming a planning committee and the first event for gay and lesbian Quakers at a national Quaker event. About a year before the Committee of Concern had their first historic gathering at FGC in the summer of 1972, gay friends from New York City interrupted the business proceedings of the New York Yearly Meeting, calling for a statement to be drafted by New York Yearly Meeting in support of gay rights. The New York Yearly Meeting responded by crafting a minute which called for the decriminalization of gay sexuality. Never before had a yearly meeting demonstrated that level of support. They asked New York Yearly Meeting friends to consider approving the minute at their next summer gathering, giving both individual friends and monthly meetings time to reflect upon the implications of approving the first Quaker minute of support for gay rights from a yearly meeting. The New York Yearly Meeting decided to form an ad hoc group called, and this is going to be a mouthful, and I'm sorry I'll keep repeating it, the New York Yearly Meeting's Committee on Homosexuality. And their charge was to study homosexuality and the experiences of gay and lesbian friends in Quaker communities. Loosely modeled upon the Britain group that wrote towards a Quaker view of sex, the New York Yearly Meeting's Committee on Homosexuality was tasked with reviewing the minute in support of gay rights before it was presented for approval the following year. A few months after the committee was formed, the clerk of New York Yearly Meeting formally expressed enthusiasm in Friends Journal for the committee's work and gratitude to the gay friends who expressed their concerns through interruption during the New York Yearly Meeting's business proceedings. The first convener and chairperson of the New York Yearly Meeting's Committee on Homosexuality was Daniel, also known as Dan, Andrew Seeger, a friend known for his strong commitments to pacifism. Seeger was regarded in the Quaker world as a weighty friend, and his voice was highly respected. In 1958, his application for conscientious objectorship status was rejected by the US government because he did not believe in a supreme being, a requirement of the law at the time as it had been written. Seeger was an agnostic Quaker, meaning he regularly attended Quaker worship and professed Quaker values, but he also was ambivalent about personal God. In 1965, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Seeger that his conviction was a mistake. because Congress and its statutory language did not intend to use the usual understanding of supreme being, but rather an interpretation that extended to seekers compulsion to follow the paths of goodness. The New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality was quite fortunate to have a clerk that had already changed the law at the highest levels of government. Before the first meeting of the New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality in 1971, Seeger distributed copies of Towards a Quaker View of Sex to each committee member. They agreed to study it and the dialogue between friends, which was occurring in response to Bradford's coming out in Friends' Journal. In the months immediately following the formation of the committee, the clerk of it received heated complaints from friends, and the clerk of New York Yearly Meeting received heated complaints, and she shared these with the committee. Letters to the editor in Friends' Journal also expressed concerns about the, quote, growing approval of gay sex and same-sex partnerships amongst friends. The New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality talked about the letters of concern in Friends' Journal, but they decided to put more of their attention on reading literature by sex education experts and statements by other churches on homosexuality. In addition to Towards a Quaker View of Sex, they were particularly interested in a pamphlet titled Homosexuality, written by Mary S. Calderon and published by the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States, which Calderon helped found and was its first executive director. Calderon was a Quaker and a distinguished sex educator who had dedicated her life's work to, quote, upending the unhealthy atmosphere of suspicion, guilt, and fear that surrounded talk about human sexuality. She was the first female medical director of Planned Parenthood, where she successfully convinced the American Medical Association to abolish its policy of limiting the distribution of information about birth control to patients. And in 1964, she left Planned Parenthood in order to found Psychus and serve as its first executive director. She was a nationally recognized sex expert, and she was highly sought after by school administrators, teachers, physicians, and social reformers, and parents seeking access about information for best practices for teaching about sexuality. Calderon was also a member of New York Yearly Meeting, and the New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality was delighted to hear that she was interested in joining their committee. So now, under Seeger's leadership and Calderon's expert guidance, in the last few months of 1971, the committee learned about new laws proposed in the New York legislature, the matter of the attitudes and practices of Friends meetings regarding their own homosexual members, and Friends' attitudes towards sexual practices, heterosexual, which depart from the traditional pattern of faithful monogamous marriage. After a period of research, they decided to form a packet, including copies of Towards a Quaker View of Sex and the letters in the Friends' Journal related to Bradford's coming out, which they mailed to each and every monthly meeting in New York Yearly Meeting, encouraging also the Yearly Meeting bookstore to sell copies of Towards a Quaker View of Sex at their next annual gathering. In March of 1972, the New York Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality invited Butler and Kaiser from the gay commune in Pennsylvania to speak on behalf of the Committee of Concern. They were particularly interested in receiving feedback on how they might revise that New York Yearly Meeting minute in a way that would, quote, emphasize civil rights for homosexuals. Recognizing the skills and talents that Butler and Kaiser had learned from civil rights leaders and gay activists, the New York Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality asked them to offer guidance on how the committee could focus more intentionally on challenging injustices. During this important meeting, Calderon spelled out the implications of Quaker support for gay rights. She said, "The way individual friends deal with the question before us will be a very profound test of their essential Quakerism. Will friends be able to respond to the essential dignity and worth in every human being, to the extent that they feel comfortable extending civil rights and religious rights to persons of homosexual orientation. By the summer of 1972, the New York Yearly Meeting had engaged with a variety of Quaker meetings, Quaker organizations, and gay rights groups, but of particular note was Seeger's conversations with Bruce Voller, a member of the Gay Activists Alliance, who would later establish the National Gay Task Force. Voller pushed Seeger and the New York Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality to move toward a more radical approach to gay rights. For example, Voller said that Gay Activists Alliance members had studied that pamphlet that Calderon wrote, and they rejected its proposition that homosexuality should be reduced, eliminated, or overcome. Calderon got a little defensive. She was like, no, you misunderstand. What we were trying to say in the pamphlet is that the experiences of homosexuals can be much harder than the experiences of heterosexual people. But this comparison did not mean to imply that homosexuality should be cured. Despite his criticisms, Voller developed a lasting relationship with the committee in New York. He put the New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality on the Gay Activists Alliance mailing list, and he provided them with many valuable reading materials, including a list of laws against gay and lesbian people. The relationship between Quakers in New York City and the Gay Activists Alliance intensified even further after Henry Weitzer, a member of Morningside Meeting and a part of the committee, participated in a historic Gay Activists Alliance action. In September of 1972, Weitzer joined gay activist members in a zap of the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission. The Taxi and Limousine Commission required that gay taxi drivers provide a letter from a psychiatrist that they were fit to drive a vehicle. To resist this policy, Weitzer and his GIAA collaborators snuck a lavender couch into the Taxi Limousine Commission office while dressed as delivery men, only to change into robes to impersonate psychiatrists. They proceeded to scribble on clipboards while they offered the commissioner various cures for homosexuality. Dozens of GAA members held placards and marched in a picket line in front of the building. And eventually, the Taxi and Limousine Commission agreed to meet with the activists and repealed the policy forever. As the work of the New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality progressed, they began to engage with more Quaker communities and individuals. Weitzer gave an address at the New York Yearly Meetings Institute for Peace, and another committee member spoke with the New York Yearly Meetings Representative Committee. When a friend from Poughkeepsie accused the committee of not giving adequate thought to, quote, the moral and spiritual implications of the whole problem, Seeger kindly and generously distributed copies of Bible verses from this concerned friend to the committee members and invited this person to one of the committee's meetings. The committee, listened with respect, but they decided not to incorporate any homophobic views into their redrafting of the New York Yearly Meeting Minute. About 100 miles away, the Meeting for Social Concerns of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting must have heard about this interesting work going on in New York when it stated in the spring of 1972, quote, there seems to be an increasing demand that Friends should recognize their responsibility to consider the matter of homosexuality and to have care for the needs of those among us who are homosexually inclined. On April 8th, 1972, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting formed its own Committee on Homosexuality under the care of the Family Relations Committee, and Butler from the Three Flowers community agreed to serve as its first clerk. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality. Friends, can we come up with better names for our committees? Goodness. They agreed to, took a few months to form its membership and would not have its first meeting until after the historic summer of 1972, when the Committee of Concern would host the first national gathering of gay and lesbian friends. Meanwhile, in the early months of 1972, leading up to the annual gathering of New York Yearly Meeting, the Committee of Homosexuality in New York continued to amend the minute about gay rights. Weitzer received support for striking a sentence which aimed to forbid expressions of sympathy for the seduction of minors or sexual acts involving force or violence. He argued that a sentence like this just suggests guilt by association. Why do we need to be talking about sexual violence in a minute about gay and lesbian people? It might unintentionally conjure up stereotypes and images of homosexual people as being predators or pedophiles. In June of 1972, an updated minute was finalized, copies of it shared with a few monthly meetings, some feedback was received, not many additional changes were made, and suddenly there was a scurry of activity because the New York Yearly Meetings annual sessions were going to be happening soon. To help ensure that their minute would be passed, the committee planned interest groups about various topics related to homosexuality to be offered during the annual sessions. 2 months later, in August of 1972, the Committee of Concern celebrated the first national gathering of gay and lesbian friends in the United States. They met for silent worship each of the days of the Friends General Conference, as was the custom for all the dormitories. They reported that their experience gave a true sense of a gathered meeting, and they frequently broke the silence of worship to express their vision for a fully inclusive religious society of friends. Matson, that pastor from Minneapolis who convinced Butler to host the Committee of Concern meeting in his living room, seems to have led the outpouring of vocal ministry. One friend said that Matson took the group, quote, to the mountaintop, and together we could see the promised land, evoking one of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. Matson's evocation of King gives evidence to show that these Quakers understood a strong link between the civil rights movement and gay liberation. The gathering of gay friends at FGC in 1972 was not, however, without controversy. Complaints about the special housing. Can you imagine Quakers having complaints? Special housing accommodations for the gay friends spread through the conference, and the overseers of FGC abruptly called a special meeting open to all to discuss the concerns. Matson was living as an openly gay man, and he agreed to speak on behalf of the Committee of Concern. He was a very talented public speaker, and he had deep knowledge of Quaker faith. But the FGC leadership decided to temporarily suspend the special housing policy for the gay friends for 1 year. Concerns were also raised about the narrow focus at FGC on homosexuality. Stephen Donaldson, also known as Robert Anthony Martin Jr., the name he was given at birth, felt the experiences of bisexual people were not being considered. Donaldson then organized a spontaneous workshop, which he reports over 130 friends attended, and the participants of that workshop developed the Ithaca Statement on Bisexuality, which is recognized today as the first public statement in support of bisexuality in the United States. Not just by a religious group, y'all, by anyone in the United States. Donaldson would publish the Ithaca Statement in Friends Journal and The Advocate, a widely circulated gay magazine in America at the time, and he would briefly chair FGC's Committee on Bisexuality before he cut ties with Quakers in 1977 in order to become a Theravadan Buddhist monk. A month after the Friends General Conference gathering at Ithaca College, the New York Yearly Meeting approved the minute that had been carefully reviewed and revised by its committee. This was the first authorized Quaker minute of support for gay rights from a yearly meeting. I'm going to read the language of the minute in its entirety. The New York Yearly Meeting is aware that there is great diversity in the relationships that people develop with one another. We suggest that the same standards under the law which we apply to heterosexual persons, should also be applied to homosexual persons. Homosexuals suffer serious discrimination in employment, housing, and the right to worship. We believe that civil rights should protect homosexuals. In particular, we advocate the revision in the light of generally accepted present-day scientific development of all legislation imposing disabilities and penalties upon homosexual persons as homosexuals. Friends are urged to continue to examine these questions. The ways in which this minute specifically takes an aim at discriminatory laws and calls us to express solidarity with a vulnerable people and enact justice really moves me in a way. It's quite different than what we're seeing in earlier periods with Towards a Quaker View of Sex, where the questions were really about sin and morality. Here we see friends taking the state and society to task and talking about human rights. And I wonder, might the minute have been different if Weitzer, a Gay Activist Alliance member, had not joined the committee that was revising it? Or if Seeger had not put the committee into dialogue with Voller, another important Gay Activist Alliance member and a rising gay rights leader? The New York Yearly Meeting Minute also reveals a shift in focus away from the medicalization of homosexuality and theological questions about gay sex as sin towards civil rights for gay and lesbian people. Relationships between Quakers and gay rights organizations were also developing in Philadelphia. Precisely how a legal agreement between Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and the Gay Activist Alliance was forged is somewhat unclear from my research, although one Gay Activist Alliance member told an interview that someone approached them and they just agreed. Somehow, a group of Quakers operating a mental health facility known as Horizon House at 12th and Lombard offered their space to the Gay Activist Alliance at a reduced rent. Out of that facility, the Gay Activist Alliance would become one of the largest, admittedly mostly male, gay rights organizations in Philadelphia. They sponsored dances and social events, as well as zaps against anti-gay politicians and organizations. They also spoke out against police harassment, just like Bradford did in Chicago, and advocated for laws which protected lesbian and gay people from discrimination. Philadelphia's first gay pride march, held in the summer of 1972, was organized by Gay Activist Alliance members at the Quaker-owned Horizon House property. Therefore, Quakers played a key role in the development of the first gay pride parades in at least 2 major cities. After the summer of 1972, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting's Gay Rights Committee finally began defining the focus of their work. They chose to follow the successful model for gay rights advocacy used by the New York Quakers. However, the Philadelphia Friends were even more connected to gay rights organizations and more inclusive of lesbian voices and experiences. Butler often gave reports at their meetings about what kind of work was being done in the Homosexual League, the Gay Activist Alliance, and the Radical Lesbians. And representatives from these groups would attend Philadelphia Yearly Meetings Committee of Homosexuality gatherings. The committee adopted the same reading list as the New York Friends, but they added Sappho Was a Right-On Woman by Sidney Abbott in order to better include lesbian perspectives as part of their work. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality focused its first year on a few key projects: making a packet about homosexuality to be studied in monthly meetings, filling a small section of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Library with books about homosexuality, and persuading Quaker high schools to purchase books about homosexuality. The committee had mixed success with these campaigns. A packet was composed, and members took this packet with them when they visited monthly meetings. Barbara Giddings, for my LGBT gay rights movement historians in the room, a resident of Philadelphia and a leader of the Daughters of Bilitis, received the business minutes of the Philadelphia Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality, and she often traveled with its members to give presentations at Quaker meetings. If y'all know anything about Barbara Giddings, that's like a big deal. The Committee for Social Concerns gave $100 to purchase books for the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Library, and friends could check out these books for free. Most Quaker schools did not express interest in the work of the Philadelphia Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality. 2 schools, Westtown and Germantown Friends, documented that they were entirely opposed. The librarian at George School requested a bibliography from Butler, which he gladly provided. At this time, Butler was working as a social studies teacher at Friends Select. When the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality visited local meetings in the Philadelphia area, it was often with video equipment that Butler, maybe without permission, borrowed from the school. And unfortunately, Butler would be fired from Friends Select for sharing positive Quaker views about homosexuality with his students. At the same time that the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality was consolidating its identity around gay rights education, the New York Committee decided to change its goals and its purpose. The minute they had been revising for the past year had been approved, so they needed to make decisions about their future work. Like the authors of Towards a Quaker View of Sex, they expressed an ambition to expand the scope of their work to include the study of premarital sex, adultery, and divorce. They developed a new name, the New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Human Relationships and Sexuality. And they took on a new project, the development of a minute for consideration by the yearly meeting about premarital sex. As their new focus took shape, the committee increasingly distanced itself from gay rights movements. A shift in focus for the group is indicated by the workshops they would facilitate at the next New York Yearly Meeting annual gathering in 1973 under the title, A Quaker View of Marriage and Divorce. This new direction for the committee was unacceptable for a few of its members. At a 1973 meeting, Seeger reports that 3 friends, including Weitzer, resigned from the group in response to the decision to table discussions about homosexuality and the law. Back in Philadelphia, gay rights groups were finding more opportunities to strengthen their relationships with friends. In June of 1973, Keith Clark from the Gay Health Consortium of Philadelphia visited the Philadelphia Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality and encouraged them to support the opening of a new gay health center. Clark persuaded Butler and Kaiser to approach the property committee of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting about a vacant building on 3rd Street, and on August 1st, 1973, about 6 months before the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the Gay Activists Alliance opened the Arrowman Center, one of its kind mental health clinics for LGBT patients. The Arrowman Center was used as an iterative and improvisational approach to community-based affirmative care. Rather than waiting for national leadership or institutional change, these community health officials responded directly to otherwise unrecognized needs of LGBT people through psychotherapy and a variety of other social services. The services offered in the building on 3rd Street multiplied over time to include the Gay Switchboard, which offered legal, counseling, and social work referrals, and the Gay Coffee House, an important social and political organizing venue for the Philadelphia gay community in the 1970s. The relationship between Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and the staff at the coffee house was consistently positive. And when disputes about how the space would be operated or paid for became a problem, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality was called in to moderate. For example, when the Arrowman Center found a new location in 1974, the remaining tenants of the 3rd Street building could not agree on how the space should be used or shared. A lesbian group sent a request to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality to use the space for their social needs and political organizing. Butler remarked at this time, quote, "Whether because of their own disinterest or their need for separateness at this point, or whether because of our own unconscious hostility, insensitivity, and male chauvinism, women have not been coming to the gay coffee house in any great number. Perhaps a gay women's center would be a better use for the building." Persuaded by Butler and the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Homosexuality, the coffee house staff entered into a space-sharing agreement with the lesbian community, and a women's-only coffee house began operating on Wednesdays and Saturdays. It continued to serve as an important space for community building and political organizing for the lesbian community in Philadelphia until 1976. All right, friends, I have one more story to share with you, and then I'm going to bring us to a close. In the early months of 1973, gay and lesbian friends from across the U.S., including members of the Committee of Concern, the New York Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality, and the Philadelphia Yearly Meetings Committee on Homosexuality, started making their travel preparations to hear Mary Calderon's highly anticipated Rufus Jones lecture. Calderon had shared with others privately that she was going to support gay and lesbian sexuality from behind the podium of Friends General Conference, which was at this time and continues to be the largest federation of liberal Quakers in North America. The speaker for each year's Rufus Jones lecture was carefully selected by the Religious Education Committee of FGC, and their message was meant to speak to the condition of friends from many different yearly meetings. During a gathering at Weitzer's home in New York, the Committee of Concern discussed how they might support gay friends who are traveling from afar to hear Calderon's talk. The committees in the two close by cities also discussed holding a joint meeting in coordination with Calderon's talk, but unfortunately that never occurred. Yet it was very clear that Calderon's address was going to be a big event for the gay, lesbian, and bisexual Quaker community. On April 27th, 1973, Calderon gave a 1-hour lecture to a standing room only audience of friends at Sandy Springs Meeting House about human sexuality and the Quaker conscience. In this historic speech, Calderon argued that Quakers must accept lesbian, gay, and bisexual people because human understanding of sexuality is limited. And the Quaker tradition teaches us that human understanding of God's will is also limited. The mystery of sex, she continued, continues to be greater than our capacity to comprehend it, no matter how much we learn about it. We engage in it, and often too frantic efforts to enjoy it, but more subtly also try to fathom its ever-recurring power over us. Surely this power and its mystery relate to the mystery of God's relationship to us. For Calderon, friends who claim superiority in their understanding of human sexuality abruptly violate the doctrine of the inner light, a fundamental tenet of liberal Quaker theology. Calderon was also speaking on behalf of a critical majority of American liberal friends from different yearly meetings who by the early 1970s were ready to say with conviction that gay sex and same-sex partnerships were not inherently criminal, immoral, or psychologically unsound, and well ahead of most other religious groups. Listen to Calderon address each of these stigmas when she said, "There is no question that most homosexuals who come to psychiatric treatment do have problems, But then do so many heterosexuals who come to psychiatric treatment. And we should be realistic enough to understand that society's attitudes about homosexuality might be at the forefront of creating problems for homosexual individuals. Therefore, passing moral judgment or taking legal actions against homosexuals will simply add to these problems. Where antisocial sexual actions are concerned, treatment, whether in psychiatry or in law, should be on the same basis, whether the individual be homosexual or heterosexual. It is not only unjust, but unrealistic to extend greater protection to the civil rights of heterosexuals for antisocial acts in the sexual area than to homosexuals for the same or lesser antisocial acts. Following the same logic, persecution of an individual merely for being homosexual is morally and legally indefensible. Finally, the liberal Quaker tradition had a voice of authority that was able to articulate and address the many legal, cultural, and social problems which were of concern to lesbian, gay, and bisexual friends in one breath. Following this lecture, the Friends Journal Conference staff convened a conversation between Calderon and representatives from 7 Friends Journal Conference yearly meetings to discuss the significance of her remarks. All of the yearly meeting representatives said that they saw a need for discussing various aspects of human sexuality in their meetings, especially in their religious education programs. In the July 1973 edition of Friends Journal, and writing under his birth name, Robert A. Jr., Donaldson wrote this on behalf of the yearly meeting representatives who met with Calderon. Friends recognized sexuality as one of the divine endowments of the human being, to be cherished and developed, even as we cherish and develop our intellectual endowments. Concern was felt that we should seek to be open to individual differences and attitudes and experiences in sexual matters, and that we should be careful to avoid committing injustice against people whose sexual behavior varies from our own, and that we should express our sexual nature in ways that enrich rather than damage the whole life of ourselves and others. That we not feel inhibited when the Spirit moves us to speak in meeting of our sexual experiences or through sex-related metaphors. Friends General Conference swiftly made tape recordings and printed copies of Calderon's lecture. I'm very grateful to the head of school of John Baird when I was hired at Westtown for putting a copy of Calderon's talk on my desk within my first weeks after being hired. He seemed to know more than I how important her talk would be to me a dozen years later. FGC reinstated permission for gay friends to meet and worship as a collective at FGC, which they've done so ever since. And the Committee of Concern laid down its closeted name and was rebranded as the Friends for Gay Concerns, which later became the Friends for Gay and Lesbian Concerns, and is also known today as the Friends for Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Concerns. Still wondering why we don't have more creative titles for these committees. All of these positive responses to her lecture indicate that by 1973, Calderon was able to appeal to a consensus which had been reached in the liberal stream of Quakerism in response to gay and lesbian people. I've now shared the stories that I wish to pass along as part of this lecture. And I would like to close with a few queries and another quote by Calderon I just can't resist. And I've made some alterations to Calderon's language so it is more gender inclusive. Where she has said he, I will get to say they. I'll leave some quiet space in between each query, and before I share a final word from Calderon, in order to provide some time for us to reflect. I also look forward to your questions, our conversation, and our continuing shared work towards building a society of friends which welcomes and appreciates a place of belonging for the widest spectrum of gender and sexual diversity. So in closing, Here are my queries. What work still needs to be done in order to create a more welcoming and inclusive community for LGBTQIA+ people in the Religious Society of Friends? What work still needs to be done in order to create a more welcoming and inclusive community for LGBTQIA+ people in the Religious Society of Friends? How do you think Quaker silent worship, the peace testimony, or Quaker historic involvement in anti-slavery and abolition movements might have had an influence on early Quaker witness to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people? How do you think Quaker silent worship, the peace testimony, or Quaker historic involvement in anti-slavery and abolition movements might have had an influence on early Quaker witness to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people? And finally, why don't more friends know about this history? Why don't we know about this history? I want to acknowledge some important work that's come before. There's an article by Petra Doan and her partner in the Quaker Oxford Handbook of Quaker Studies, which lightly touches on this history. Stephen McNeil has a really wonderful article about AFSC's involvement in LGBT justice that was printed in Friends Journal. There's been some theological musings by Friends and kind of philosophizing about Quaker connections to LGBT experiences that have been published. But the book I'm bringing out is the first academic book about this history. Why haven't Quaker studies picked it up? Why hasn't LGBT studies picked it up? Why has it taken this long? It's a important question for me, and one I look forward to dialoguing with you all further. But in closing, let's hear Calderon's words again, and then I'll go ahead and sit down and ask Jen to take us into the next part of our time together. Calderon said in 1973, "Friends profess belief in nonviolence, but surely the friend who sits in judgment on another human being in their sexual way of life, which does not harm another person, does triple violence if they will not engage themselves to protect the conscience of the other. They do violence to the individual whose right to be different they refuse to defend because they do not wish to appear to condone what they disagree with. They do violence to their own friendly conscience. And they do violence to the cause of human justice and rights for all human beings." Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. I just want to give a moment to appreciate you. Folks can clap if you'd like to or wave your hands on Zoom. I'll put you on gallery view so Brian can see you if you'd like to, but I'd like to appreciate all that you offered us. So friends, we have some time available for questions. I'll get in front of the camera so folks on Zoom can see me. I'm hiding in the back with all the tech. We have some, can I sit closer
Yeah,
to you?
yeah.
Great. We have an opportunity for some questions. For folks on site, you just need to have access to a microphone in order for the folks on Zoom to hear you. And for folks on Zoom, just raise your physical or electronic hand and I'll call on you to ask questions. And we can sit in contemplative silence if there are none or as we're waiting for questions to rise. Kat, I'm going to give it to you.
Thank you so much for such an interesting lecture. I'm curious about, as you think about the sources that you've used in your historical research, where are the gaps in the archive that you would want to be filled in? And do you have any hope that you might find like sources that would fill in those gaps?
Yeah. So some gaps that I'm very keenly aware of is there was some really good and interesting work happening at San Francisco monthly meeting in support of gay rights. And I haven't had the opportunity to tap into that archive. I mentioned today the first yearly meeting minute of support for gay rights, but I believe and I want to confirm that the first monthly meeting of support for gay rights came from San Francisco yearly meeting. Also, I mean, I said at the beginning of my talk, like, what are the next chapters? Like, what I didn't mention today that in 1979, the Gay Rights March on Washington was organized at Arch Street Meeting House in Philadelphia. So, what did Quakers do to like convene those gay rights organizers into that space? I'm very curious about like after Stonewall like loses its punch, where had the Quakers stick around? Were they still like intimately like active, or do they feel like they had succeeded in something and kind of like receded? And then the chapters of our history about Quaker involvement in the HIV/AIDS crisis, advocacy for same-sex marriage, and attention to transgender issues and justice. There are some materials in these archives that are personal correspondences between the clerks of the yearly meetings and some of its members that are sealed from historians and only accessible by permission granted by the Friends for Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Concerns clerk. When I approached the clerk at the time about this research, I was not given permission, and I want to honor the reasons for doing so, in that many of those correspondences might have outed people that didn't want to be out, would not want to be named in like an academic project, and even if I promised that I would not include their names, like I still want to respect like the sensitivity for my knowledge of who those individuals might be. And there's some information in there about like distribution of funds or resources to like help alleviate like suffering and dire situations people were in. So like there is a timeline of stipulation where like I won't have to ask permission, but also like I think the work is solid on its own and I might not need it, Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting to hear this history. I was wondering if you could say specifically again, what were the archives that you used? And then I was also wondering, the Friends collection at Guilford College, if that was something that you considered, or if there's stuff there that might be interesting, because it's geographically an important, North Carolina is a very important place for Quakerism and in the United States. So.
Yeah, so the specific art, the primary one I used was the Friends Historical Collection at Swarthmore College. And shout out to Jordan and Cecilia, who were my archivists, who like, I couldn't have done this without them. Also the LGBT Religious Archives Network that I partnered with the production of the online exhibit about Towards Quaker View of Sex. A lot of what I learned about Kaiser, Butler, Matson came through interviews that Mark Bowman, who's the director of that organization, did with them, including interviews of some of the authors of Towards a Quaker View of Sex. Friends Journal has all of their archival materials, open access online. And then there were some like gay activist organizations that gave me some insights into their archives too. But no, I haven't explored the materials at Haverford, Guilford, or Earlham. I think those would be like places to dip in and see what I could retrieve. I don't know if they would be helpful for this time period. It seems like San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia were the vectors of Quaker conversations about gay rights, but in the like further projects, absolutely so. Yeah. Maybe check in online. Are there any questions from online folks?
I just would like to say I appreciated your connection to the New Swarthmore community. New Swarthmore just in September had a reunion in Western Massachusetts. It occurred for about 3 days, and we each person shared sort of what had they done for the last 50, 60 years. And we heard some of this history of the Three Flowers community and so on at that reunion. So it was quite exciting to hear it around the full circle coming from your mouth as well. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
And Jody, you've given me a thought in response to your sharing that's connected to the question which was just shared is the archivists at Swarthmore have talked to me about doing like an oral history project and like capturing more stories, and like most of my work has been with documents and papers, like not with like human beings. If friends are interested in, teaming up, being a part of whatever that might be. It's in just kind of like a brainstorming exploratory phase right now. Please out and we'll start forming a community of, academic and amateur researchers to produce that kind of work.
So I also want to say that New Swarthmore had documents there in the same archives, and we went through a process of trying to, and they were also, you had to get permission from XYZ before you could actually look at them. And so we've been going through a process to try to make them more open and available. So if you do want to do like oral history, you might want to continue look through the whatever you can and contact some of those people and see if they're interested in doing that.
And if folks think they might have anything useful in your like basement or attic that's in a box, like please donate it to these archives rather than, waiting for the next fire or flood that will destroy them. I believe the FLGBTCQ QC, excuse me, donated their materials in 2017. So a lot of what I shared with you today, I couldn't have without having access to that prior to 2017. So like, yeah, trust the archivists and support them.
I have a question, which is just, so you mentioned New York and Philadelphia. I'm wondering if your research uncovered anything about New England yearly meeting in that time period.
No.
I thought it might not have, but that's okay.
No. I was really intrigued by a podcast I was listening to about the HIV/AIDS crisis in P-Town. And it was mentioned that the Quaker meeting there operated kind of an unofficial hospice for gay friends who were in need of care. And so, yeah, I imagine as the story goes on, we'll find other communities, Guilford, New England, San Francisco, coming into the fore. And also the debates about like minutes of inclusion and respect for gay and lesbian people. I think those started to happen in a crescendo in other yearly meetings later in the 1970s and throughout the 1980s.
I don't come from a Quaker tradition, so the language is a little bit different.
Yeah.
I come from a Mennonite tradition. And I think one of our questions has been, where does the authority come from to make these decisions? So we talk about biblical authority a lot, and, and it can go either way. But, there would be other like psychiatric authority or the spirit-led movement or whatever. Where does authority come from to make these decisions in the Quaker tradition?
Okay, so I have a response to this kind of question that might feel a little dissatisfying, and that is to assert my role as a historian and not as a theologian or a social scientist of church communities. So I'm very much invested in finding evidence and doing the storytelling about what that evidence shows, but I really try to pause and hold myself from pontificating, prophesizing, proclaiming what friends should do or where they should find their authority. It's a good conversation to be had, but it's not, I think, one for me to lead.
Right. But Mary Calderon would have had, you as a historian would look at Mary Calderon and say, this is where she got her ideas, or, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I see Mary Calderon as like taking the Hicksite impetus to emphasize the inner light to its extreme. For friends on the call or anyone gathered here today, Quaker history has this big schism between the Orthodox and the Hicksite, which essentially is around the question of, when I sit down and worship in silence and the inner light gives me a message, what do I do if that message contradicts something that's written in the Bible? Do I give the Bible ultimate authority and say, oh, I must be confused, this must be my ego getting out of control, I'm trying to assert an agenda, I need to rethink whether this message has truth? Or in the Hicksite perspective, it was, truth is constantly unfolding, the inner light is constantly leading us to new truth. What can we learn if we follow that path? And I think Calderon was saying queer LGBTQ people are discovering things about themselves and the truth that they experience through an investigation of their own inner light. And friends need to honor that and respect that and give it credence of value rather than assert their own understanding, which sometimes can be intellectual or morally couched rather than spirit-led. Yeah. Hey there, I tried.
This question's a little bit orthogonal to the topic of gay rights, but you're a historian, you're spending a bunch of time in Quaker archives, you're in dialogue with these documents, and you're probably frustrated some of the time. And of course, this is a tradition that extends into today and the future. What should we, as yearly meeting leadership or clerks of monthly meetings, or what should we be thinking about to make the future version of you less frustrated when you're looking at the documents we're producing today?
Well, to be honest, the primary feeling wasn't frustration, it was gratitude. I was speaking with a friend after the Rise of Worship this morning about my appreciation that Quakers are like these meticulous note takers. Y'all like having these recording clerks that are like trying to write down everything in every single committee meeting that has been such a service to me in doing this historical work that I'm not sure would be the same for someone researching Mennonite tradition or Catholic tradition or Lutheran tradition. I guess if I could offer a plea for growth, it would be creating, capturing the sense of a meeting amongst friends or ideas, feelings, experiences of friends that aren't caught in the formal structures of our meetings and our yearly meetings, right? I can only know what happened in those committees. I can't know what young adult friends were experiencing in those meetings at that time, or I don't have clear insight into what friends of color were experiencing in the 1960s and 1970s who were also queer. You know, capturing more of those stories outside of the formal structures would help just advance the work better. But I'm feeling very satisfied. I'm feeling very, yeah, overall gratitude. Yeah.
Just want to turn it back to Zoom for a moment to see if there are any last lingering questions there. Okay.
And one more
Yeah.
in response to David is once this book comes out, and I'm also doing a virtual exhibit about this history with the Out History Project. If you are in a role in a yearly meeting or a monthly meeting, you can help just spread the word about it and let's make it so this history is commonly known amongst friends. Yeah, that would be a great means of support too.
I want to offer one last question to you. You can choose to answer or not. But you've been doing this research for a long time. Just what has finishing your dissertation and sort of wrapping up this history meant to you? Like, what has it felt like for you? What has your experience been of it?
I think it was Maya Angelou who said, don't write the book you think people need, write the book that you need to write. And so really this investigation started as I was coming out as a gay Quaker, and I was trying to understand what my tradition had to say about my sexuality. And I'm one thing that has come out of the research that you'll hear in the lecture I gave in coordination with Pendle Hill was the first happy gay couple in an American novel were portrayed in Christopher Isherwood's The World in the Evening. And Isherwood told his literary friends the title of that book was Too Queer to be Quaker. And he had the assumption that Quaker culture was so invested in plainness and simplicity and ordered business and practice that it didn't leave enough room for queer flamboyance and extravagance and expression in that colorful way, the rainbow that queer people need, that allows them to feel like they can really actualize their authentic selves. You know, this room doesn't look very queer, y'all. And so that's where I struggle. That I feel like I have done this research and I have felt like, gosh, my tradition historically has really affirmed who I am. There's a theology there that gives me a place of belonging. There's a practice where I can sit and understand who I am, and I can share and feel my experiences are understood and heard by my community. But culturally, I don't feel like Quakerism has yet arrived at a place where we got LGBT people knocking down our doors. And so I think that's where I'm left as I'm kind of closing this part of my work.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for closing out this lecture of this series, the Making Queer Quaker History series, and giving our Ernest and Esther Reed Memorial Lecture. I really appreciate all that you offered us. And friends, this will close. I'll get in front of the camera so Zoom folks can see me, but this will close our time together. I'm going to close the Zoom room momentarily, and folks on site, we have some refreshments available for you momentarily. Thank you, friends.